passage from the Diamond Sutra. The 32 Marks of Buddha. The Diamond Sutra, Section 26. The body of truth has no marks. Subhuti, what do you think? May the Tathagata be perceived by the 32 marks of a great man? Subhuti answered, Yes, certainly the Tathagata may be perceived thereby. Then Buddha said, Subhuti, if the Tathagata may be perceived by such marks, any great imperial ruler is the same as the Tathagata. Subhuti then said to Buddha, World-honoured one, as I understand the meaning of Buddha's words, the Tathagata may not be perceived by the 32 marks. Whereupon the world-honoured one uttered this verse, Who looks for me in form, who searches for me in sound, his footsteps go astray, he cannot find the Tathagata. So this is a section ongoing of a passage from the Diamond Sutra. As we remember, this is the Diamond Sutra belongs to the Prajnaparamita, or the wisdom gone beyond cycle of sutras, the greatest of which is the Prajnaparamita in 8,000 lines, and perhaps most famously in the Zen school and also in the Mahayana generally, the Heart of Great Wisdom Sutra in the sort of Sino-Japanese, the one that begins Makahanya Haramita Shingyo, the Heart Sutra, which is perhaps the best known and most frequently chanted sutra. I'll give some we have an article on it with various curated items covering this sutra, which I'll leave a link to below this talk. Anyway, this section here, the Buddha, and just for technical purposes, the Buddha is actually referred to by three appellations, three ways of naming. Tathagata, which means thus come, and is one of the names of the Buddha. He's also referred to as the great man, as in the 32 marks of the great man. We'll come to that also in the moment. And then he's also referred to as the Buddha as well. Remembering also that the person he's talking to is Subhuti. Subhuti was one of the great arhats, and he's one of the great arhats that actually appears sympathetically in many of the Mahayana sutras and teachings, as well as in the Pali Canon as well. He's one of the 10 great arhats, along with people like Moggallana and Shariputra as well. And Subhuti and the Buddha, in fact the Diamond Sutra is simply a dialogue between the Buddha and Subhuti on the subject of emptiness, although the term emptiness in fact doesn't appear anywhere in the text itself. It's quite a short text, the Diamond Sutra, and can be read fairly quickly. Anyway, this is particularly the verse that the Buddha utters at the end, just to say, is very well known. Who looks for me in form, who searches for me in sound, his footsteps go astray, he cannot find the Tathagata, is one of a number of koans, in fact, that are used in the interview room in the Zen school from this sutra. There are a number of them, and this verse in fact forms one of them. But to begin with, we're going to look at this subject of the 32 marks of the great Buddha, or the 32 marks of a Buddha, because it's said that there are indeed 32 major marks of a Buddha, and also 80 minor marks as well. And these you can look up. You can find them on Wikipedia if you want a list of them. And they are such things. The 32 major marks are such things as the imprint of 1,000-wheeled chakra or wheel on the sole of the Buddha's foot, earlobes that reach down to his shoulders, hands or long arms that reach down to so that his hands dangle by his knees when he's standing, also that his body shines as gold, etc. So these are just some of the 32 marks of the great man, as it's referred to here. And we have to really remember that, in fact, the Buddha gave instructions after his death that no images should be made of him. And so, therefore, no images were made of him for about 700 years, until the Gandharan period, which was round about the 2nd century of the Common Era, when statuary began to be produced in the northwest of India, what is now Pakistan, and also Afghanistan. This was the Gandharan period and empire, and this was also happened to be the area that had been invaded by Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, who was 5th century BC, round about the time of the Buddha, in fact. And as I'm sure many of you know, he reached into Afghanistan and also into the western part of India. The Alexandrian Empire didn't really survive Alexander himself very long, so that collapsed. But the Greeks themselves, who came with him, they remained in the area, and they intermingled, married into the local tribes, the local kingdoms there, and so there was this Greek influence in art. And by the 2nd century AD, the first statues of the Buddha were being produced. And again, I'll leave a link below to see an example of this. We've featured various examples on the Zen Gateway of this type of art, and you can see very much its sort of Greek influence, really, if you look at the robes, etc., and the way the face is. In fact, some of the early, this one isn't, but some of the early statues featured Buddhas and Bodhisattvas that had moustaches as well, so they were highly decorous. And you can see the sort of flowing robes as well. The shapes there, are very reminiscent of clothing in that Greek style, and the figures themselves also. You can see that influence. So around this time, these statues were being produced, and in fact, curiously also, around this time, the Diamond Sutra may well have been produced. The Diamond Sutra itself, its construction or compilation, ranges anywhere from the 2nd to the 5th century. But certainly, I think it's sort of a little bit before the 5th century, probably nearer the 2nd century. So there's a sort of contemporariness with this passage about who sees me in form, who looks for me in sound, his footsteps go astray. He cannot find the Tathagata, he cannot find the Buddha. And yet these images were in fact being produced. And so because prior to that time, because there was an absence of imagery, the Buddha was symbolically represented. So images of the footprint, the Buddha's footprint, for example, showing that the Buddha had been there but wasn't there now. So there was this was a symbol of the Buddha's presence without his form actually being present. The empty throne was another one, and a handprint was another one as well. And there were various others too. And these 32 marks sort of arose as ways of being able to give a sense of the presence of the Buddha without actually breaking the commandment to show the Buddha's form itself. And over time, certainly as we enter into the Mahayana period, these 32 marks were not just physical descriptions, but they also came to symbolize the various virtues that the Buddha had accumulated over his previous lifetimes. If we're familiar with the birth stories, the Jataka tales, these are the previous birth stories of the Buddha, where the Buddha develops, compassion, develops patient endurance, develops generosity through various practices and incidents in these previous lives. These were perfected. These became the paramitas, the perfections that, when fully ripened, led to his final incarnation as Prince Gautama, and then the ascetic Gautama, and finally the Buddha after he'd sat under the Bodhi tree and awoken. And so these 32 marks were important. They were symbolic representations not only of a physical imprint, but also of a virtue or metaphysical imprint, we could say. And so they came to represent the practice itself in this way. And of course, what we have here, because we may sort of think, well, why did they break the Buddha's injunction not to create forms of the Buddha? Well, the way round that was to say that by the time of the 2nd century AD, no one knew what the Buddha had looked like. The descriptions in the Pali Canon are sparse and vague, to say the least. So there was never going to be, after 3/4 of a millennia later, there was never going to be any real threat that the Buddha's actual physical form, as he lived and died 2,500 years ago, was ever going to be represented. And we remember that, of course, by this time, the perception or the conception of the Buddha had now changed. The Buddha was no longer just the man who lived and died. That was considered to be just one particular manifestation body of the Buddha. This manifestation body, or transformation body as it's also called, is known as the Dharmakaya. But there was also another body that was considered to be the true body of the Buddha, known as the Dharmakaya. The true body of the Dharma itself. This was considered to be the Buddha's actual real body. But the Dharmakaya, which is also synonymous with terms like Buddha nature, heart Buddha, and so on, this was considered so wholly other and beyond any conception of words and thoughts, etc. This is what the Buddha had seen, in fact, on his own awakening. And in the Zen school, when anyone is said to have awoken or attained great realization or had kensho or satori, what this means is to have realized the Dharmakaya. In fact, there's a whole raft of koans called the Dharmakaya koans, which are specifically designed to bring to fruition that realization. So the 6 patriarchs, before thinking of good and bad, what is the true face before father and mother were born, the true face being the Dharmakaya. The sound of the single hand, Master Hakuin's famous koan. Sometimes it's rather sort of crudely put as what is the sound of one hand clapping, but it's actually the sound of the single hand. And the other one, of course, is Joshu's moo. A monk asks Master Joshu, does a dog have Buddha nature? And Master Joshu replies, moo. And these are 3 Dharmakaya koans. So these were to realize the true body of the Buddha that pervades. And there's an intermediary body that's known as the Sambhogakaya, which bridges the Dharmakaya, the manifestation, and also the Dharmakaya. And if you like, this manifestation body goes by various terms, such as reward body, such as the body of bliss, such as also the body of light and illumination, and what it really refers to is the body of the teachings and practice. This is the body that is created through the practitioner's efforts in the field of practice, whether it be zazen, chanting, upholding the precepts, following the Buddhist life. This is the formation of that body. So we can see that it's an intermediary body because it appears to lead us from ignorance to that realization of the Dharmakaya, to seeing the way things really are, enlightenment, kensho, satori, etc., etc., etc. So these 3 bodies are not to be seen as belonging to a Buddha out there. These bodies are seen to be our own body. the Dharmakaya, which is just the same as saying that the Buddha nature is inherent in and throughout all beings, pervades the universe, of course, including you and I. Obviously, right now in time and history and place, we exist as beings, individual beings. This is the Dharmakaya. And then if we are engaged in practice, there is the body of the teachings that is being enacted, that's actually being put into practice. And this brings us back again to these 32 marks, because these 32 marks, represent, as I've said, physical attributes, yes, but also they are connected to metaphysical or practice virtues, such as generosity, such as patient endurance, etc. And this is why, coming back to the statuary that was being produced, the statues, the images of the Buddha, were the images of the Sambhogakaya. So the images themselves that have these attributes, become symbols, living symbols, not just metaphors, but symbols, through the power of meditation and contemplation. They were meditated upon, they were contemplated, and they became therefore the medium through which the Sambhogakaya became realized in the being of the practitioner, him or herself. So, the practice was to contemplate the form of the Buddha, to see that. And if you look, and this is why very specific instructions are given in the construction of a Buddha image. You don't just slap some paint on or chip away at some stone. There are very strict rules about the proportionality of these images. And a lot of training goes into their construction, because they have to be right to convey the accuracy of accurately the teachings themselves. So they have a certain gait, they have a certain harmony, they have a certain aesthetic, they have a certain sublime sense to them. The eyes of the Buddha are downcast. There's a slight smile on the Buddha's lips, expressing bliss and inner awakening. There's beauty there. There's gentleness there in the form of the hands and the feet, etc., which don't destroy but preserve. There's obviously the different Buddhist iconographies have different mudras or hand gestures of fearlessness, of giving, of teaching, of the earth-touching mudra, a very famous one, where the Buddha calls the earth to witness the truth of his own awakening to Mara, and so on, and medicine Buddhas as well. So all of them, the body, the physical form itself, embodies and is an expression of a teaching in this way. So, the teaching and the physical form and the true nature, all these things are nested one within another. They bear this relationship, and such contemplations and meditations on these marks and forms was seen as extremely helpful. In a way, this is sort of bypassing the purely sort of intellectual route. It becomes an embodiment of something, and it reminds us that of Master Dogen, the founder of Soto Zen, who asked his monk, or said to his monks one day, he said, "Why do you sit zazen? Why do you sit meditation? Do you think you are doing this in order to become enlightened? If so, then look at the seated Buddha, look at the sitting Buddhas in the meditation hall. What are they doing? They're sitting zazen. Well, they're Buddhas already, so why are they sitting zazen if they are already enlightened?" And this was really to shake his students up, because this idea of gaining and grasping and attaining is still very dualistic, still very I bound, it's in denial of the truth that of the Mahayana, which is that all beings are already Buddhas and have been from the very beginning, just that we haven't realized it. So he used that to shake them up, and he went on to say the reason that we sit Zazen is that this is what Buddhas do anyway. We sit Zazen because this is what Buddhas do. And, I think we have to consider Zazen in a much wider context than just sitting meditation. In other words, the state of Zazen itself, which is not just something that we do sitting down, it's something that we're cultivating in all our activities, every moment of the day, and during sleep even. But during daily activities was probably good enough for us at the moment. We could spend time perfecting that. He's showing basically that the practices of following the precepts and the chanting, making offerings, and practicing the virtues, etc. These are things that Buddhas do anyway. These, in other words, are congruent with our true nature already. And particularly something like the precepts, this is very true. If we look at those precepts, not to harm others, not to take what is not given, to avoid harm sexually through speech, and also to avoid intoxication in its widest understanding, not just drink and drugs, but also intoxication, particularly by the passions, particularly by our opinionatedness, which can be very intoxicating for us. Goodness me, you just have to look at ourselves in the world right now. But this has always been true, actually. There's in a way, there's nothing particularly. There have always been peaks and troughs, of course, globally in the world. Anyway. So to avoid intoxication, these are the things that Buddhas do anyway. And of course, such things are not really specifically or uniquely Buddhist, although they're formulated in this particular way in Buddhism. These are the lay precepts, of course. But actually, if we look at them, people who study religion, talk of what is called the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule is summed up rather nicely by the rabbi who was asked to expound the whole of the Torah while standing on one leg. And so standing on one leg, he said, he accepted it, obviously. Standing on one leg, he said, the whole of the Torah can be summed up as follows: do not do unto others as you would not have them do unto you. Everything else is commentary. And he put his leg down. And in the New Testament, it's put in the other way around: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And if we look at those two statements, what we see is, in fact, for those two things to be morally true, they have to reflect reality as it is really, as it is understood mystically or religiously in that non-dual way, as we call it in Buddhism, which is to see that oneself and others are not separated, and therefore there is, because of this connectivity, there is a reciprocity. So if the opposite were true, if the self was actual, was real and separate from others, then indeed the Golden Rule couldn't apply, because it wouldn't be reflecting the truth, which is that there are separate selves. Why would I put myself in your shoes? Why would you put yourself in my shoes? We are separate selves. The fact that there aren't separate selves, the fact that the Buddha taught no I, anatta, means that the truth ethically reflects the truth of the true nature of things, which is that there is a deep and profound interconnectedness between us all. And this shines through in the very human, just very living state of empathy, that we are empathetic creatures. And life is responsive to others. It takes its form through relationship, through relating. That relating is the opposite of a separate self. The fact that we can relate is living proof that the separate self is a falsity, is not true. So these things are all nested, ethics and reality and the true nature, etc. These things are all nested one within the other. They reflect each other. They reflect the truth of everything in their own specific sphere or area. So again, something just to be aware of there, and that the whole of the teachings are really very much sort of tied up together. And so this was the point that Dogen was trying to really bring forward the fact that although we may not realize that when we're practicing the precepts we are practicing as Buddhas already, this embodiment, it takes us closer and closer towards that realization, sort of nudges us in the right direction. And it's interesting really because to have that sense that when we sit down in Zazen, we are joining the Buddha under the Bodhi tree. When we recite the Heart Sutra, which is the where the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara is talking to the Arhat Shariputra, and he's explaining to him the true nature of emptiness. It's the one that begins, form is emptiness, emptiness is no different from form. And what we are doing with that is that the heart is participating with Avalokiteshvara. Whether or not this actually took place is irrelevant. The point is that in the imaginal, in the Sambhogakaya, these things are taking place, and when we participate with them, then we also participate in the merit of these activities as well, and that's what makes these activities meritorious in the end. It's interesting to note actually that this is not something that was uniquely Eastern. In fact, it was understood by the Neoplatonists of Alexandria, particularly Iamblichus, who wrote a book called On the Mystery of the Egyptians, where he says that it's not enough for Platonists to sit and think great thoughts. These ideal forms have to be enacted, and by ideal forms he was referring to the deities, and he was giving a Platonic basis for the rites and ceremonies, in fact, of the Egyptians. And what he was saying is that when the name of a deity is recited, when the ceremonial gestures of a deity are performed, when the hymns to the deity that recount the virtues and the actions of the deity are sung, then these things are the deity. The deity isn't something that is called in. These things manifest the deity here and now, awaken it, if you like, and awaken us to the presence of the deity. Hence why ritual is extremely important. Now, obviously in Zen there isn't a lot of ceremony, although there is some. Sitting Zazen together in a zendo is definitely ceremonial, so is chanting, so is the lighting of the incense, and memorial days and so on and so forth. But also when we practice, when we follow the precepts, when we practice, in that way, when we're practicing Zen or practicing mindfulness, with our daily activities in work and home, wherever we are, these are ritualistic forms that are the things that Buddhas do or would do in those situations. This is how perhaps we can usefully see our own training, not as something that's got anything to do with I, but the moment when we let go of this I and we begin to participate in the Buddha field, in the Buddha stream, the area of influence of our Buddha, which is Shakyamuni, of course. So there's a lot of resonance there. Now, of course, the problem is that the problem with these things like statues and images and marks and so forth is that we can become attached to them. And therefore the Buddha, I think this is probably why the Buddha here is uttering this particular stanza, this particular verse, because what he's saying is, look, yes, the Buddha manifests through these things, but do not make the mistake of grasping at these forms, because forms are empty. They are gateways, and they are vectors, and they are vehicles, but they are not the thing itself, and to not lose sight of that subtlety. So when Subhuti says, yes, these 32 marks are the way to perceive the Buddha, he says, no, don't make that mistake. It's not a case of just making a statue and saying, look, my Buddha's better than your Buddha, and we start comparing statues and then fighting over it again. This is idolatry. And so the Buddha utters this stanza: who looks for me in form, who searches for me in sound, his footsteps go astray, he cannot find the Tathagata. So in this contemplation of the Buddha, don't get stuck on oneself trying to extract the Buddha, or to see the Buddha in this statue. There's a space in between. These are elements that are necessary, but in fact there's a space in between in which Buddha, the presence of Buddha, can manifest, and we can awaken to that presence. Of course, we can then go the opposite way as well. As well as being idolatrous, we can become, too abstract. This is going back to Yambalaikas, why he was going against what he had been taught, that the great Platonists, his teachers, were saying, you just have to sort of think these great ideas. And he said, no, that's too abstract. It doesn't involve life. It doesn't involve the activities of the everyday. It doesn't involve your body. And spiritual teachings must be embodied. And this too is reflected. There's a nice story of Master Joshu, who a monk comes to him, and a senior monk comes to him and says, what is Buddha? A very classic question. And Master Joshu replies, the one in the hall, meaning the Buddha statue that sits on the altar in the meditation hall, in the zendo. And the monk sort of retorts and recoils and says, no, that's not what I meant. That's just an image, a lump of stone. And Joshu nodded in agreement. No, said the monk, what I mean is, really, what is Buddha? In other words, this Buddha referred to, who looks for me in form, who searches for me in sound, his footsteps go astray, he cannot find the Tathagata. Well, in that case, what really is Buddha? Master Joshu replies, pointing to the statue, the one in the hall. So that's the other medicine that's needed for when the teaching gets too abstract and we fall into that wonderful sort of philosophical and lovely ideas, how beautiful they can be, and there are some very beautiful ideas in Buddhism, to be careful and to remain grounded, and yet even in the images themselves not to grasp. Okay, we'll leave that there for now.